So today we're going to talk to you about third-party use of your building, and I'm going to go over some of the sort of legal-esque aspects of that, and Jeff Cook will then move to some of the insurance aspects related to that. And so I'm Letitia Mayberry Wright. I am the Deputy General Counsel at GCFA and General Counsel on Finance and Administration of the United Methodist Church. And thanks for your time today. We'll go ahead and get started. So why do we care about this in the first place? First, we are the church and we're called to be missional. We have an obligation to be good stewards of the resources, and we have an obligation to provide safe spaces. So we have an obligation to open our doors to the community and to use our resources wisely, and to do that in a way where we feel comfortable and ensuring that we're doing it safely, and that those people who will come in, their lives will be enhanced rather than harmed. This providing safe spaces is also super important beyond the moral imperative, because when incidents happen, and as I'm sure you're aware, there's been a lot of news about sexual abuse cases and litigation in churches recently. That incident that maybe happened a long time ago also rears up again later, and causes even more damage later. It causes damage to all the people. The ripple effect is ginormous. And then when the litigation happens, it takes ministry money and resources and time when the litigation happens. So the whole situation is terrible. And as much as possible, we need to take the time to prevent it. So I'm going to talk to you about some preventative measures and some standards that we can have to prevent harm in general. And so one way to sort of remember this is to think of it about the 4 Ps: prevention, purpose check, probe the third-party organization, and then consider policy considerations and enforcement. That's sort of the bundle of tying the bow at the end. That's really important. So when I talk about prevention, what I mean is start from the beginning. Before you even consider allowing other people to use your space, you should be doing this anyway for your building, for your regular attendance, but you want to go and inspect the premises and understand where the issues are, what needs to be fixed, and to ensure that the space can be utilized in the way that you're foreseeing it to be used. The next step is when you start to consider organizations coming in, you really need to spend some time with them and ask them some hard and serious questions. Do they have volunteers or employees? Do those volunteers or employees have any vetting that they go through? Does the organization deal with children or adults? Are those children or adults particularly vulnerable? Do they have standards for recurring vetting? Do they have other policies around providing safe prevention and those considerations if they are dealing with those vulnerable populations? Do they have safety and first aid equipment? Do they happen to be dealing with chemical or hazardous materials? And then once you get the answers to these questions, you should consider, does this align with the mission and ministry of the church? Is this something that we want to have? So instead of it being only a question of, do we need this in our building because we need additional resources? Does it work? Should be part of the analysis. Does it work with what we need, or will it cause us more problems in the future? So the next step in this is the policy considerations. So after you probe the organization, you consider it, you should have a standard process, a sort of a document where we're going to categorize what needs to be included in this lease agreement. And those types of things to consider are the time of the use of the building, the location within the building. And when I say this, a really good example is if you're talking about having an AA group utilize the building, and you also have a preschool facility on site, it's really important to think about the time of the use of the building and where those two things are located within the building. So it's supposed to be anonymous. That's the point of it, but you don't want something that's anonymous with no background or even understanding of who would be there entering into a children's facility. So set expectations for security and entry. Separate access points are always better no matter what. And then limited access to different particular parts of the building. So maybe it means that you need to wall off your preschool building with a door that has a code on it, particularly for the preschool. Similarly, when you have those types of organizations in your building, they need to have safety protocols set up. So you need to put it in the documents, that in the lease document, how often you expect background checks. If you expect them to have the same standards as your safe sanctuaries policy, then they need to meet those standards and you need to give it to them. And then you need to have them sign off that they're meeting those standards, and you need to send them updates when you make updates. You need to tell them what type of safety equipment they need to have on the building, and set housekeeping expectations. So who's going to take care of what on the property? And then a process for reporting maintenance and security also should be outlined, and when the church can enter. Now that might have special rules depending on what state or county that you're in. And then again, consistent policies. Now this document, we can't provide you this document because it's going to be different for every state. And honestly, every county might have different rules around what they require in lease agreements. And they should be tailored for the different types of organization. Again, if they're dealing with vulnerable populations, you might say, we have this safe sanctuary policy. We want you to sign that you're meeting these expectations and initial onto that. And so, but another thing to consider when we consider pricing, which is going to be an additional topic of conversation in just a minute, is to consider including in the price a reasonable fee for an attorney to create a lease agreement that really works for your organization and the organization that's entering. So when I mentioned policy enforcement, when you sign the lease and if you're saying, hey, you have to comply with our safe sanctuary document, that needs to be updated. And so there should be a process of, we're going to look at this every year, and we're going to look at the documents every year. Or every time we have a new pastor, we're going to look at these documents. Or every time the person who's responsible for this, maybe it's your board of trustees, chair. Every time the chair changes, we're going to relook at these documents so that everybody knows they exist and what the process is and what standards need to be met to ensure that there's safety and consistency. So I mentioned that we're going to talk about some financial implications. That's where, again, the contract document comes in. So I think it's really important to have some sort of lease agreement if you're having someone stay in your space for any significant amount of time. Again, that would include insurance. I'm not going to get into that aspect specifically, but who's responsible for insurance, who's responsible for all these different things that we talked about, and why and how, and for you to understand that. But then another financial thing to consider is, if you lease your space, you might have zoning requirements, you might have building code requirements, depending on what type of space and who is leasing your building. And you might have accessibility requirements that are now newly imposed on you. So it's good to know those up front and to take the time to figure those out. You don't really want unexpected costs in the process of leasing your building. Similarly, you might have tax consequences. You might have UBIT consequences. That is unrelated business income tax. That is a whole another topic. We actually have a whole hour webinar on that. And so you can look that up on our website if you're interested more in that. But essentially, when you start acting like a business, you have to pay taxes. So you are competing against businesses who do have to pay taxes, and that can sometimes occur with the rental of property, depending what type of property, and honestly, if you have a mortgage on. So that's worth a consideration. And another thing to consider is you might have to start paying property taxes. That is very county specific. So as you are considering that, they might change just a portion of your property that you would have to pay taxes on. And it is possible that you would lose your property exemption on all of your property if you have it. Most counties do, and most states do. So those things are, again, we're considering. It does not mean you should do these things. It just means consider the cost and consider the implications and enter them well so you don't have unforeseen problems in the future. And then the last topic is insurance coverage, which Jeff is going to talk about more. But I want to cover one more additional topic because we are the Methodist Church, and that is the Book of Discipline requirements. If you enter a lease for more than 30 days, there is a paragraph that tells you those processes that you need to go through. It's the same as if you have a mortgage on your building or selling your building. So if you're entering it for more than 30 days, you need to have a charge conference and have a majority vote on the lease. And then when you sign the lease, the pastor and the DS need to sign their consent as part of the contract. It is the pastor's and DS's responsibility to bring this up with the district board of church locations and buildings. So to determine, again, this sort of goes back to the purpose check, but to make sure that it's in alignment with the mission and ministry of the organization. So please make sure you go through these steps. The paragraphs are listed here. They're two different paragraphs, and that's just because one is for an incorporated church and one is for an unincorporated church. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff to talk about insurance. And Jeff?
Thank you, Letitia. My name is Jeff Cook, and I am the president and CEO of United Methodist Insurance. And so congratulations, you just entered into a lease, and someone is making use of your facility. And as prices go up and budgets get tightened, understanding the impact on the cost and availability of insurance is important, especially in this hard market. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about containing risk and reinforce some points that Letitia made about loss prevention, and I'll give you a little insight into why that's important. And then we'll talk about how this affects your insurance policy. So as you know, leases determine who bears the risk of damages and injuries. And you want to make sure that that falls on the group that is leasing your property. Your new exposure, therefore, is going to require that you obtain confirmation of their coverage, and we'll talk a little bit about how you do that and why you do that. And another thing to know is that your coverage and pricing may be affected. And so the best time to start talking about insurance is when you start talking about leasing. Then you want to make sure your agent understands who you're working with and what effect that might have. So we'll talk about loss prevention tips, coverage matters, and certificates of insurance. Letitia hit on most of these points, and you do need to have that process for them to report maintenance and safety issues. Identifying the important thing to do is follow up. Make sure that you identify issues that are their responsibility and make it clear to them. And then you need to take action on yours. Document repairs or corrections that need to be made by them and repairs and corrections that you made. The reason for this, the reason this is really important is, as I always like to say, the cheapest claims are ones that never happen. So if you can prevent a loss, you can save injury to people and you can save money on lawyers and medical bills. Plus, it may also limit your exposure. If it's clear that you did everything you could to ensure that the facility was maintained and safe, it may provide you with some shield against liability. Now we'll talk about some policy matters. It's really, really important that your insurance agent understands that you're going to enter into a leasing agreement. And as Letitia pointed out, you want to make sure that you and your agent understand the nature of the business that's being entered into and the steps that you're taking to make sure that it's being done safely. And it may do two things. One, it may increase your insurance cost. and it may even force you to change carriers depending on the nature of the entity that leases your space. We had a situation in St. Louis, Missouri, where one of our insureds was opening their space to be an incubator for local small businesses, and their carrier told them that they would no longer provide coverage. That's a good thing to know in advance, because then your agent can begin to look for carriers that would be amenable to do that. And if you do it enough in advance, it may even change your mind about whether or not you enter into that leasing agreement. Letitia also talked about chemicals and hazardous materials. Your policy may not provide coverage for you for a pollution event. And if that contamination is on your facility, they're not covered. If it spreads to other places and they're not covered, you may find yourself with an uncovered pollution event. So again, provide details of the nature and use and the user to your agent. The more information they know, the better they'll be able to give you advice as to how you should handle this situation with your insurance carrier. Another thing to know is that the agent should actually see the whole harmless language that you have in your lease, so they can help you understand if that transfer of liability is going to be effective or not. Now, when it comes to insurance coverage, there are two things that I think are really important. One is that you should be named as an additional insured on their policy. And what that will do is make it clear that you are covered for the activities that they're undertaking at your church. Doesn't mean that you're covered for everything else that they do, but it does provide you protection with respect to their operations. The second thing is that you should obtain a certificate of insurance from the third party. And we'll talk a little bit about certificates of insurance. The name on the certificate of insurance that you get should match the name in the agreement. This will confirm to you that the entity that is leasing your space is actually the entity that is covered on the insurance policy. You should check the coverage expiration date. And if the policy expires before the lease agreement does, you should make sure that you note somewhere to ask for a new certificate at the expiration of that policy. You want to make sure they have two types of coverages. One is general liability, and the second is workers' compensation. And the reason you want to make sure that they have workers' compensation is that provides sole remedy coverage. So if they're injured at the church, it's in the course and scope of their employment. And if the facility is properly maintained and you haven't any exposures that may be your fault, then that sole remedy can really help prevent lawsuits against you. So make sure the other things to know is you want to make sure that their limits match or exceed your policy limits. So you should have at least $1 million worth of general liability coverage, and so should they. If you are entering into a lease agreement, I'm not sure why you would enter into a lease agreement with someone who you may not trust, but if you have any questions or concerns about the certificate of insurance that you receive, you should request a copy directly from their agent. And again, I'm not sure that you might have questions about whether or not they'll be telling you the truth if you're releasing space to them, but it's a good idea to make sure that certificate is exactly what you want it to be. And another thing you may want to do is request an updated copy periodically to ensure that coverage is in place. I have had clients that obtained certificates of insurance for coverage on a policy that was in place on Monday and canceled on Tuesday. So those are things to consider when you're looking at insurance and the effects of that new risk that you've undertaken and the ways to protect yourself.
All right, this is where I jump back in. And webinars with Letitia are always fun because we get all these complicated legal questions. Brian Mills is also the same way when we do webinars. So I'm going to start with a general one for me that I think is going to help a lot of people in the chat here so far. And that is, a lot of churches don't necessarily or weren't aware of all of these intricacies, all of these details, all of these rules, the fact that doing certain things exposes them legally and through insurance claims and so forth. So what can we say? What would you say to a church that maybe somebody's watching this and going, uh-oh, like we're not currently doing these things? What would you say to them in this moment?
So I would say there's no time like the present. You can't fix what happened in the past. So let's move forward and let's fix it now. So I would say let's go through and be like, okay, who's using their building? Come up with a great list. Doesn't matter if they're paying you or not, because you still have the same liability issues. So you should still have the same agreement, have agreements related to that. And procedures of where they can access, when they can go places, stuff like that, safety procedures. And so let's create a list. Let's get everybody to sign up for this and move forward.
Jeff, same question for you. What would you say from an insurance standpoint if a church maybe wasn't aware that they needed extra coverages or that it could change their coverage plan based on a business being in, or what would you say to them as they maybe need to like take some first steps?
I think Letitia hit the nail on the head. Your first call should be to your insurance agent. Should inform them exactly what's going on. Send them any documentation that you have that could help them understand what's been done. As a friend of mine used to say, more information is better, too much is just right. So the more your agent knows, the better advice they can give you. And, if you're going to have to change carriers or change coverage or terms, you need to get moving on that, because claims won't wait. If it happens and you didn't get it covered, it could ruin your year.
So I think this one goes back to Letitia, and I think it's in context to other entities renting or leasing space in the church. What if that business that wants to rent space is also a nonprofit? Does that make a difference?
It doesn't make a difference in relation to whether you should have an agreement, follow safety protocols. It could impact your, like, the property, some of the financial implications possibly. And so that's worth looking at, but it doesn't always necessarily impact that in the way that you would think. So it's worth still investigating and seeing if that's going to be an issue or not.
And kind of piggybacking on that question, Benjamin asked, what's the trigger for needing a lease or needing an agreement? Because we're talking about two separate things. We're also talking about people maybe using the space that are not actually paying to use the space, but that's a separate category in some ways than people that are actually maybe paying to use the space. Can you talk about the differences and what still might be needed regardless of which category they fall in?
Yeah, I also saw something about a piano recital. So I'll try to hit on sort of like these one-time, one-use things versus continuous use versus paid continuous use. And at the end of the day, the best practice would be to have a document for each one of these types of scenarios. So if you're having someone come and do a piano recital, you should still have them sign like a waiver, just like you would if you're letting your kid go to the trampoline park. They're going to have you sign a waiver. You're using our facility. We want to, and if you're allowing them to use it for free, no problem. But we're not going to be responsible for anything that happens during this. That's your responsibility. So that's step one. And then step two is sort of like this continuous use. And again, no matter if they pay or not, if it's a continuous use of the space, you should have some sort of agreement, whether you call it a lease agreement, whether you call it a facilities use agreement, what you call it might be different. We have a template document for Boy Scouts related to a facilities use agreement with a Boy Scout. And that's very tailored to Boy Scouts because we know a lot about that organization specifically. We as in the United Methodist Church and our relationship and how those operate and how Boy Scout troops operate. And so we are able, and we know all about their insurance coverage. And so we're able to outline exactly how that facilities use agreement will work. That is an agreement that is seen as not including a fee. So, and in some situations, you might want to borrow that agreement for the Boy Scouts. If you have another organization that is also dealing with children, you might want to have something similar. But again, it's very tailored to Boy Scouts. But and it's also maybe where you charge a one-time fee to these organizations to say, look, we need someone to draft an agreement that works for us. So we're going to charge you a one-time fee so that we can cover those costs. And then you'll have an agreement set up.
And I would always request a certificate of insurance. You probably, one-off piano recital probably doesn't make sense to go through the motions of being an additional insurer in their policy unless it's a regular occurrence. But you definitely always want a certificate of insurance.
I think the next question I'm going to field, and that is, several people are asking, yes, this recording will be available to everyone who registered for this webinar. We're going to email that to you. Included in that email is also going to be a copy of the slides that were used today for you to share with your church leadership, as many of them may not be aware of all of the intricacies here. And then also contact information for us will be in that email. And we're happy to help you out with legal questions. And also, Jeff is with our United Methodist insurance program. And Jeff, this might be a good time for me to just kind of segue and ask, let's say a church, they contact their insurance provider, they want to add some capacity to be able to enter an agreement, and their insurance provider doesn't want to offer that. Can you talk a little bit about United Methodist insurance program and what we have to offer and how that could work for them?
Right. We work with an exclusive endorsed agent, the Sovereign Insurance Group. And for 60 plus years, they've been working with churches and nonprofits. So the good news is if you are bringing a nonprofit operation into your church, they know someone who's not afraid to cover those types of risks. So if your local agent is stumped, or if you just want to give us an opportunity to earn your business, we're here. We are the denomination's property and liability program, and we are also rooted in the Book of Discipline, as any good Methodist operation is. So we are organized to fulfill GCFA's obligation to make sure that property and liability insurance are available to all the ministries of the connection, including agencies and foundations.
Thank you for that. Another question we had was, what is UBIT? Unrelated business income tax, right? So we have a whole webinar we did on that. We have resources available to that. But Letitia, can you go give us the super condensed, what are unrelated business income tax and how can it affect a nonprofit like a church?
So for UBIT, the biggest consideration to think of in this is when you rent property. It can come up in multiple ways, but when you rent property, the general high level rule, there's lots of exceptions to is if you rent property, you would have to pay taxes. There's an exception that if your mortgage is paid off, you don't have to pay tax. So there might be, if your mortgage is paid off, you maybe would not actually have to pay UBIT on the property. So that is the 22nd version of a problem. If we wanted to talk about it, we could probably talk about it for 3 hours.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's somewhat helpful. Please check out the resources before you make any decision. Also, Andrew is so right. We are very available to help you, but we can't answer specific legal questions. I would actually have a hard time with my license if I did that. And so we try to give really helpful general information, and then please leverage that and use that information to get very specific, helpful answers from local counsel that will know exactly what's going on in your area. And that's why I keep coming back to just ask them for a small fee to get that help that you need.
Yeah, we're getting I think we're losing ground on the questions, which is great. These are wonderful questions. To cover a few of them that I've seen, people are asking for examples of leases and waivers, and what to continue what Letitia said. I know we would love to be able to offer that, and we can offer guidelines as far as what to look for in those types of situations. However, as Letitia mentioned, based on your county, your state, your local circumstances, you wouldn't want a cookie cutter. It would not fit your application necessarily. So you really do want to make sure you engage legal counsel that's able to make sure you're protected and protected well. So
Right. And as you're considering costs, I've seen a lot of questions about cost. Is that fair to say, Andrew? There's a
yeah,
is you as a church get to determine what it is you want to cover, right? So I mentioned some foreseeable issues that could arise that could have real financial implications for the church. And so you want to make sure you consider those, and then consider, is this a mission, a ministry or mission, maybe this organization, but we want to support it. And so we want to financially take on that burden. Or is this, we want to partner and provide a space essentially where they cover our costs, but not we don't really make any money off of it. Or is it a mission where you guys can share costs and they can help not only cover your costs, but give you an additional cost, but maybe it's not at market or it is at market. You get to decide those things, and all of them are fair game. So it doesn't mean you can't do any of those things because you are a nonprofit organization. If you go back to UMIP, if you start becoming a real estate developer, all of a sudden you're not a church anymore. So that's a different consideration, unlikely in almost all situations, but please watch the UMIP if you're really entering that field.
Another question, would it be a good idea to have employees and or owners to do a background check through us with Ministry Safe? I'm assuming this is saying external people that might be renting or entering a lease agreement with the church. Would it be a good idea to do background checks?
And so I think a lot of it is I personally, if I were in a church situation, would not want to take the onus of being responsible for the organization that's utilizing my space. I want them to be responsible for it, but you could offer that as they can get background checks through your avenue that you have, and also acknowledge that they are doing it and that is their responsibility to do. So it's not your responsibility. That seems like taking on extra obligations that you have your own obligations to take on already. Again, it's all a matter of what you want to take on and you see as your ministry. Of course, if that's something you want to do, but you should need to do it right, because you're also taking on obligations with that and other ramifications.
And I think you would want to check with Ministry Safe as well and see if your agreement with them would allow you to piggyback a third party on your agreement.
Jeff, I have a question for you from a Jeff, and he's asking, how do we handle insurance if the church is dropped by a carrier?
Well, that's a question I get more and more frequently. I think in the last 4 months, I've talked to more churches than I have in the first 4 years I was here. Unfortunately, in today's environment, the major church insurance companies are dropping churches. We've had a great deal of success at UMI in finding coverage for churches. We work, our partner Sovereign works with over 32 carriers. So if you're dropped and you're looking for help there, I can tell you that, they've gone through a lot of hoops to help churches. We had a church in Texas that was turned down by 24 carriers. The 25th agreed to write them. So if you go to www.uminsure.org, just request a quote and they'll get back to you very quickly, and they'll find coverage for you.
That's right. All right. There's been a few questions about parsonage rentals. So I think the questions are kind of twofold. I think there's a UBIT part to them, as well as it is still a church property, right? That still needs to be covered. So do we have any information on renting a parsonage? What would you all say to that?
So it is still the church property. Most often, you really need to think about the financial implications related to the parsonage. It's in those situations when you start renting it, it's pretty likely that you're going to lose property tax exemption on it. And so you just need to consider that in your analysis and how hard it would be to get back. If you foresee like renting it for a year and then you might want to get it back the next year, that's just a consideration to think about. And then also related to me, but you just need to consider it's unlikely if it's paid off, if the parsonage is paid off, it's unlikely that you'd argue that, look at that. But then also you definitely need a lease. And you need a lease, but it's a rental property of like a home. There's pretty standard leases available for this type of situation. And you want one of those and you want to set up who's responsible for what, all of those same things, except for even more in an extreme situation, because you're talking about someone's living setup, which can trigger a significant amount of different requirements. So that can work very differently of like when you can insure the property versus like it's a business property.
And Letitia, I saw in the chat, and I've also seen in experience churches where the parsonage is not being utilized by clergy, maybe merged with another church or many different reasons. And what a lot of people in the church will say, and I understand, is, well, it'd be better to have someone in there than to have a vacant home, right? And I totally understand that. But the reality is that in many of those cases, we see a church say, well, it's just sitting there empty. If we get anything for it, it's better than nothing. And again, I get the mentality, but the reality is you could risk the tax exemption on that property, but also all of these other hoops that you have to jump through could have financial implications down the road. And so it's just something that churches may want to consider. It's not necessarily a financial move to do that without getting something that you can recover those costs to create those agreements. Do you agree with that?
So the way that I often say this is you should 100% rent property, utilize it, but you really need to be thoughtful about the price that you ask for in the process and consider all the costs. And it's not, if you go out and you're anyone else renting the property, what would that cost you? And you can probably get some advice through them, because like the repairs, all the things that you might need to take care of to meet the standards of the living conditions that are required in your area or whatever might also be additional costs. So all of that is just consider the cost of what that looks like.
Well, and I have a question for you, Letitia. If you're in a situation where you do end up having to pay the unrelated business income tax, as long as you're whole, right, or still coming out ahead, there really aren't any other downsides. You're just paying a tax, and you have to factor that into the equation, correct?
Absolutely. And that is true in almost all situations. Again, unless that starts being like your main source of income, right? And so all of a sudden you're not a nonprofit, you're a rental agency or something.
Right. So
and that's at around, you should start to look and talk to an advisor with you getting to 10% of your income.
Right. So there is a threshold at which it becomes a real concern.
Oh, if you're paying income tax, if you're not paying income tax, not doing something, it's considered passive income, and that's not considered doing an activity that would be accounted.
Right.
I'm going to go as far as to say we're going to send out the information on the UBIT webinar in the follow-up email, because we're getting a lot of questions that were specific to that. So I just think it's worth it. It's a great webinar. We had amazing questions during that as well. Here's this next question. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer this one. I know I don't even know where to begin. The question is, would farm ground be considered taxable if leased to a farmer? Does that make sense? Like farm zone?
Absolutely. There's probably some exception that I am not aware of. This is not in my purview questions that I've ever received. There's always a new one, which makes the job interesting. But this is a new one. I would ask somebody about that. Because there are weird exceptions. There's weird exceptions for churches who buy property and plan to build on them later, but rent it. So if that's what you're talking about, there's an exception for that. So if you have purchased property to build a church on in the future and it's farmland and you're renting it back to a farmer, it actually might implicate this rule, which we have information on. So it's not in the UBIT webinar, but check out our website and the tax packet.
Another insurance question. Can you speak to churches that have been dropped due to the age of the building? What are their options? And I think this kind of follows up your Texas example earlier.
Yeah, there are specialty carriers who will insure older buildings. And I mean, there are a number of ways to look at this. You can look for a carrier that will write an older building, or you can ask yourself if you can continue to afford to maintain and update that building. Sometimes you're locked in if it's a landmark status. But my advice would be to find someone who, find an agent that understands how to cover older buildings and where you can go for those options. Usually you end up in an excess and surplus lines market, which is going to add cost to what you're doing. And at the risk of appearing to do shameless self-promotion, I can tell you that the Sovereign Group they have yet to drop the ball on a problem I've sent their way. And if you're in that situation, I would ask them, and they can probably give you an answer fairly quickly.
Well, and Jeff, I'd even argue that it's not necessarily shameless self-promotion, because it is. UMIP exists because of mandate in the Book of Discipline to make sure that the United Methodist Church is able to provide insurance for our property.
Well, I know, but I hate to give the appearance of.
Well, then let me do the plug for you.
Yeah, thank you. But no, we say it all the time, and I know UMC Support says it. Our ministry is to help your ministry, and that's what we're here for. So I have a vested interest in seeing that your old building gets covered.
We had mentioned getting a COI, or a certificate of insurance, from entities using the building. What happens if there's an entity that does not have insurance coverage?
That's a question of whether you're willing to bear that risk or not. If they don't have coverage and something happens, then you're on the facility, and they're going to look to you to see if you can provide coverage, and it may or may not be covered with your current policy. I would discuss that with your agent.
All right, I'm trying to read and catch up. I think we're almost caught up now. Let's see. We had a deal that a church could cancel 30 days prior to our appointment. Okay, got it. Somebody asked, what is considered an older building from an insurance standpoint? What would be your answer to that?
Yeah, I think it varies from carrier to carrier, and the needle has moved. I think as you get towards 75 years and up, most carriers are beginning to look at it that way. I'll get an answer for you on that, and we'll get that out in the email. I know our agents can give you some specifics on where that number is now.
Awesome. I think we're there. I'm not seeing any new questions come in.
There's one about Church Mutual, that if they offer both property and liability coverage, and they do. Okay. Typically, Church Mutual, Guide One, Brotherhood, all your major carriers that are insuring churches are offering business owners policies and package policies that include both property and liability.
Oh, I missed one here about a wedding. Taking this to the extreme, if someone came to us came to the church for a wedding, for instance, who is not a church member, I suspect we should have a document in that instance, even if it's not a paid transaction.
That goes back to the, like, no matter if you're hosting something in your building, even if it's a one-time event, you could still have a waiver, sort of like the trampoline park set up. It's just hopefully a lot less dangerous. And similarly, I think that would answer the follow-up question about the waiver and the COI. Nothing is guaranteed, right? So all that we are trying to do is mitigate the risk. And just because you have the waiver doesn't mean that you're not going to get sued, which is going to be expensive. Yep. And unfortunately, it's to deter that type of activity. And in case of the lawsuit, to have the waiver on file. Unfortunately, there's a lot of times when people sue people that should not be sued. There's not a legitimate argument there, and it still costs money to defend yourself to say, I should not be sued. And that's frustrating, and it's just a reality of life. So there's no way to protect yourself 100% in any situation. It's just a matter of mitigating the risk as much as possible.
Let's see. Got a question about, in reference to hold harmless agreements. I think this is getting down into it here. Is it illegal to put in the agreement defend and hold harmless instead of indemnify and hold harmless?
So that's a question, again, that I can't answer. It's going to be different, and the way that you're going to want to word that is going to be different. So it's worth these are the things that it's worth figuring out. And if you want to have sort of a standard template for a specific situation, investing in getting that standard template reviewed or drafted by someone. If you have an attorney in your congregation who's willing to draft it, maybe even if it's not their area, and then have someone else look at it, that's hopefully an efficient way to do that.
All right, I'm pulling up the UBIT info right now to put it in the chat, because that seems to be requested here. So I just put in the link. That'll take you to our web page that has the webinar and all of the documentation that goes with the unrelated business income. And again, we'll put that also in the email that goes out, as well as our contact information. I am going to share now this last slide we have, just so people have a chance to see it while we do our goodbyes. In the top right corner, you have a QR code. If you point your camera on your phone at that, it'll take you to our UMC support. You can sign up for the collaborator there, and that's where we send out a lot of these resources. The bottom right, that's the United Methodist Insurance Program, and that's what Jeff Cook is president of. And if you scan that, that'll sign you up for the Church Protection Connection newsletter. And again, a lot of really good information in there about how to deal with a lot of this stuff. And I know Jeff and I have had discussions how in the last 6 months to a year, the whole kind of culture around insurance seems to be changing. So there's a lot of updates in that. And then also on the left side is Jeff's contact information. You have his phone number and email address there. And we're going to, like I said, we'll send this slide deck out as well. Letitia, Jeff, any last thoughts here?
Just thank you for spending the time with us today, and good luck with your ministries and utilizing your building.
And make sure you're covered.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, at GCFA, it's our ministry to support your ministry. We thank you, so many of you, for joining. This was a great questions, and we look forward to hearing from you and how we can help support you in the future. So have a blessed Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.